See, if people didn't do this, unfortunately, you guys wouldn't have a job. Well, there's a lot of truth in that matter. Let me tell you. This case takes place in Tasmania, Australia on the April 28, 1996. Martin Bryant was a 28-year-old man who was born in Hobart on the May 7, 1967. From a young age, Martin showed signs that he was different. He grew up in a normal and loving home. Despite this, Martin would reject physical affection from his parents, and he didn't seem to want to bond with them. He would often self-isolate, a problem that became more apparent when he entered school. He was slow to develop speech, had difficulties making friends, and was often aggressive. In August of 1977, he was suspended from the Newtown Primary School. Following his suspension, he was assessed at the Hobart Diagnostic Center. It was in this assessment where Martin spoke about harming and torturing animals and that he enjoyed tormenting his sister. When Martin was around 10 years old, he was hospitalized. He was playing with some fireworks and accidentally severely burned himself. I broke the stick trying to get out, but I couldn't, and it made all from in my jeans. Do you think you'll be playing with firecrackers anymore? Yes. Don't you think you've learned a lesson from this? Yes. But I'm still playing with him. There are some records of Martin's behavior during his time at school. These records reference stealing, violent outbursts, and tormenting vulnerable children. It's noted that he enjoyed picking on these children and took much delight in their discomfort. At this time, he was thought to be hyperactive, and Martin was placed on medication. However, Martin would later say that the vast majority of his memories from school are of being by himself, being ignored by other children, being viciously bullied, and being scared to go to school. At home, Martin was also a challenge. His father made numerous attempts to make him normal. When Martin was around 14, his father bought him an air rifle. With this new air rifle, Martin took to hiding in a creek bed alongside the house and fired at passing traffic. He would also spend much of his time shooting at birds. If he was able to hit a bird, he would approach the carcass and fire many more shots into the bird. Martin was assessed and was found that he had an IQ of just 68, and that he had the emotional and intellectual capacity of someone much younger than himself. They also determined that he could be schizophrenic. By the time Martin left school, he was given a disability pension, as he was deemed to be unable to hold down a job because of his impairments. To make some extra money, Martin would do odd jobs for people such as gardening or cleaning. It was doing these odd jobs that Martin would meet a woman named Helen Harvey in the year 1987. Helen was the heiress to the Tasso lottery fortune. She was a considerably wealthy woman and owned a number of properties. Helen was in her 50s and was known as a rather eccentric and isolated woman. She lived with her mother in one of her mansions, which was at the time quite run down and the garden needed attending to. Helen employed Martin to look after the garden and to do some basic cleaning. But as time went on, the two became very close and developed a strong friendship. Martin would later say that Helen was his only true friend. In July of 1990, Helen's mother passed away. Following this, Martin moved into the mansion with her. Inside this mansion was over 40 cats and a dozen dogs. The two would go on expensive shopping trips and would spend large sums of money. Money was now no issue for Martin, but despite this, he still collected his disability allowance. To be able to collect this money, Martin needed to be checked by a medical professional. This medical professional noted the following. His father protects him from any occasion which might upset him as he continually threatens violence. Martin tells me he would like to go around shooting people. It would be unsafe to allow Martin out of his parents' control. Helen would often drive Martin around. On a number of occasions, while sitting in the passenger seat, Martin grabbed the wheel and turned it, causing the car to crash. Crashing the old car, however, was no big deal, as Helen was the recipient of a steady and substantial income from the Adams Estate Trust. A car salesman would later say that he remembers selling Helen a number of vehicles. She would come in always accompanied with Martin. At the beginning of every month, she would just buy a car on a whim. However, when the monthly income from the trust run out, she'd take the car and sell it. And then when the next month's payment came in, she would go in and buy another car. Transport Tasmania records indicate that she owned in excess of over 50 vehicles during the period of time that she was friends with Martin. In October of 1991, Martin moved to Copping to a farming property where he lived with Helen. It's reported in court documents that Martin kept a small pig in his room at night until the pig got so big that it was no longer possible. It said that one of his favorite movies was Babe, but he could have kept the pig in his room for a more twisted reason, as you'll find out later in the video. Whilst living at this farm, Martin would sometimes fire his rifle at unsuspecting tourists as they stopped near the market stalls on the highway. Some reports also mention that he even shot at a neighbor's dog. On the October 20th, 1992, Martin and Helen had gone for a drive to purchase some groceries. As they were driving back, the car veered onto the incorrect side of the road and collided with an oncoming vehicle. Helen was instantly killed in the collision, aged 59. Martin was badly injured. He was admitted to hospital and suffered fractures to his vertebrae, fractures of the ribs, and a head injury. Following this head injury, he was unconscious for over an hour, and for weeks after, he suffered from bad headaches. A scan was conducted on his brain, which is said to have showed no signs of brain damage. Despite the fact that Martin had caused previous crashes, there was no investigation into Helen's death, and he was never charged. Although Heather's neighbor, Barry, would later say that Heather once confided in him and told him that she couldn't drive faster than 35 kilometers per hour because of Martin's erratic behavior. She said, "One day he's gonna end up killing me." Barry provided a statement to the police, but he believes it was never followed up or taken seriously. He also told the police that Martin had threatened to shoot him and his wife. He also believed that Martin was stalking his property at night. He would often find unexplained footprints around his property. As a result of this, Barry purchased a gun just in case Martin ever tried to attack his family. But this would not be the only strange death of someone close to Martin. After the death of Helen, Martin inherited her estate. He would now receive her trust fund payments and her properties. Before passing, Helen had written Martin into her will and given him absolutely everything. Martin was now incredibly wealthy. In 1993, Martin's father Maurice was found dead. His body was discovered in a dam on the family property after going missing in mysterious circumstances. A neighbor found a note pinned to the front door of the farmhouse that read, "Call the police." The emergency services began to search the 29-hectare property for Maurice. It's noted that Martin was at the farm with the emergency services, and he was not taking what was happening very seriously. It's said that he was trying to impress the officers and made several jokes about the situation. The police found Maurice's body face down with Martin's weighted diving belt around his neck. A note and a large sum of money was found in a car nearby. It's important to note that in the lead up to Maurice's death, he had been acting strangely, and he had also been making preparations for his death, such as changing the bank account over to his wife's name, among other things. It was ruled that Maurice took his own life. However, some have speculated that Martin could have had something to do with the death of his father. An officer working on the case who had grown up near that area noted an unusual amount of sheep carcasses in the water. He pointed out that sheep never drink from the watercourses in Tasmanian spring or winter, and they rarely fall in. A total of $250,000 was left for Martin in his will. Maurice was a major part of Martin's life and helped to keep him somewhat grounded. Despite some of Martin's antisocial behavior, Helen and his father were influences which helped contain his behavior. In an attempt to make new friends, Martin would dress in strange and bizarre clothing. He would wear a bright blue suit, carry a briefcase, and would tell people at his favorite restaurant that he was a businessman who earned a lot of money. The owner of this restaurant would later say, "It was horrible. Everyone was laughing at him, even the customers. I felt really quite sorry for him. I realized this guy didn't really have many friends. He was like a child trying to impress everybody. He struck me as a very eager sort of young guy, like a Labrador puppy. Always had something to say, always trying to impress." Martin also made numerous attempts to begin friendships with young local children, and would try and show them adult videos. Martin ended up selling the farm property and began traveling the world. His favorite part of these trips were the flights, and this was because he could speak to the fellow passengers and they had nowhere to go. He would go to Sydney, Melbourne, Miami, London, Bangkok, Tokyo, among other places. In late 1995, Martin lost his luggage while returning to Australia, And when found, Customs discovered 4 illegal X-rated videos. All of them included adult humans with animals. Martin would later say that in 1995, he decided that he had had enough and sometimes thought about taking his own life. He also allegedly told one of his neighbors, "I'll do something that will make everyone remember me." In early 1996, Martin began purchasing a number of weapons. Also in 1996, he placed an advertisement in a newspaper. He was looking for a gardener for his mansion. A woman named Petra Wilmot was employed by Martin to work at the mansion. After a short time of being employed, the two began a relationship. Martin had had a couple of girlfriends before Petra, although none of them lasted very long. For Petra, this was her first boyfriend. On the April 15, 1996, Martin and Petra went shopping in Hobart. Martin told her that he needed to get a bag for Tai Chi classes and had brought along a tape measure to make sure it was big enough. Although, Martin would later tell the shop assistant that he needed strong handles, as the bag would be used to carry lots of ammunition. And now we arrive to the April 28, 1996. Martin on this day set his alarm for 6 a.m. His alarm went off and he and Petra had breakfast together and showered. He then loaded his yellow Volvo with his bag that he had bought that month. Inside the bag were handcuffs, rope, a hunting knife, 3 semi-automatic weapons, and a significant quantity of ammunition. He then set off to Port Arthur. On the way, he stopped for coffee and told some people that he met that he was going surfing at Roaring Beach. Martin kept a surfboard on the roof of his car. However, he couldn't surf. He just liked the surfer aesthetic and wanted to imitate it so people may like him. On the way to Port Arthur, Martin headed first to a guest house called the Seascape Cottage, owned by David and Sally Martin. This guest house did have some significance to Martin. His father had previously tried to purchase the guest house, but David and Sally had beaten him to it. Martin apparently believed that David and Sally had bought the property to deliberately hurt his family, and blamed the couple for the depression that led to his father's death. Martin drove to the guest house and shot and killed David and Sally Martin. There were no guests present at the time of the shooting. However, shortly after killing the couple, 2 tourists had spotted the guest house and stopped to take a look at around 12:30 p.m. The tourists were a married couple, and they just wanted to have a look around. The couple got out of their car and began walking towards the Seascape Cottages, when all of a sudden Martin appeared. The couple later said he appeared to be agitated. He was making jerking movements with his hands and was moving around nervously. The husband said, "I wonder if we could have a look around one of the apartments." Martin replied, "No. My mother and father are out for 10 minutes. I can't show you around because my girlfriend is inside." The couple described his manner of speech as strange and rude. The two became quite uneasy. The wife said to her husband, "Come on, let's get out of here." The couple walked back to the car, got inside, and began driving away from the property. The wife looked back over her shoulder as the car traveled onto the highway. She said Martin was standing at the front of the house, looking in their direction. Shortly after this, Martin left and drove towards Port Arthur in his Volvo. On his way to Port Arthur, he stopped to speak with 2 people who had broken down. Martin chatted to them briefly and was asked if he was going surfing because of the surfboard on his roof rack. Martin replied, "No, I'm going to the Isle of the Dead to get rid of some wasps." Martin then suggested that they meet later at the cafe at Port Arthur. He then continued to drive. At around 1:30 p.m., Martin entered the Broad Arrow Cafe. At the time, around 60 people were inside the building. Martin bought some food and drink and sat outside. One customer overheard him saying that there were a lot of wasps around and that there were too many Asian tourists. Martin then got up and entered the cafe again and found a table that was not occupied. He placed his bag on the table and immediately took out an AR-15 rifle, which was filled with a 30-shot magazine with 26 live rounds of ammunition in the magazine at the time, and began firing upon the unsuspecting victims. A survivor later described to the police his observations and said that Martin was not saying anything, but he appeared to be laughing in an aggressive way rather than in an amused way. He said that Martin walked from table to table shooting people in their head. The attack had been so fast that some of the victims still had cutlery in their hands. He then made his way to the gift shop part of the building, shooting at anyone he could, and would go in between the two sections. A woman named Caroline Nash witnessed the attack. She managed not to be seen as she was lying underneath her husband's dead body. Peter Nash. Peter had been covering his wife to save her from the bullets. One man who survived being shot in the neck heard Martin say, "No one gets away from me," as he fired the gun. Whilst all of this was happening, the two on-duty police officers were over 40 minutes away at the Saltwater River. The echo effect of the gunshots made it impossible to know where they were coming from. People started running for their lives, but had no idea where to run or where was safe. Martin left the building and shot and killed more people in the car park. He then got back into his Volvo and began driving again, firing bullets from his window as he did. A woman named Nanette Mychak and her two daughters, Alana aged 6 and Madeline aged 3, were running from the scene. Nanette believed they had reached a safe distance and told her daughters they were now safe. However, at this time, a yellow Volvo was driving towards them. An onlooker saw Nanette approach the vehicle, as she must have thought that this car would provide some kind of escape from the area. Martin got out of the car and put his hand on her shoulder. Others who were trying to flee were close enough to hear him tell her to get down on her knees. Nanette did as he commanded and pleaded with Martin, "Please don't hurt my babies." Martin then shot her in the head. He then turned and fired 2 shots into 3-year-old Madeline, killing her too. Alana, the elder of the 2 children, ran behind a tree off the roadside. Martin then turned his attention to her. He fired as she ran behind the tree. Martin then approached Alana and pressed the gun hard into her neck before firing a shot and killing her too. Martin then re-entered his vehicle and drove towards the toll booth. Her BMW had just entered through the toll booth as the shooting had started. The occupants of the car were warned by an elderly man that there had been a shooting and not to go any further. Inside this BMW was Mary Nixon, Russell Pollard, and passengers Helen and Robert Salzman. As Martin approached, Robert and Martin got into an argument. Martin pulled out his rifle and shot him in the chest. Upon seeing his friend being shot, Russell jumped out of the car, and he too was shot in the chest. Martin then walked round the BMW and shot both Mary and Helen and pulled them from the car. Martin transferred ammunition, handcuffs, the AR-15 rifle, and a fuel container to the BMW and took off, leaving his Volvo behind. Martin, now in a BMW, drove to a petrol station. There, he blocked a couple in a Toyota who were trying to get onto the highway. A man named Glenn Perez was driving the car with his girlfriend in the passenger seat, Zoe Hall. Martin got out and rushed towards the car with the rifle in his hand and tried to pull Zoe from the car. Glenn got out and tried to stop him, but Martin raised the gun and forced Glenn into boot of the BMW and locked him inside. As Zoe tried to escape, Martin shot her in the neck and killed her. With Glenn in the boot, Martin drove the BMW at high speed along the highway and returned to the Seascape guest house. On the drive there, Martin shot at a number of passing cars. As Martin pulled up, another car passed by. Inside this car was a young woman and her boyfriend. As she drove closer, she noticed a blonde-haired man standing near the BMW, and this was Martin. Holding the gun by his side, she thought at the time that he must have been waiting for them to pass so he could shoot rabbits or some other animal. She slowed down further until she saw Martin aim the weapon and fire a number of shots. One of the bullets entered into her right forearm, essentially blowing her forearm to pieces. Despite this horrific injury, the couple managed to get away. Martin continued to shoot at passing cars. The police had already been notified about the Port Arthur shooting. However, due to Martin shooting at passing cars, they now knew where he was, and they made their way to Seascape Cottages. After shooting at numerous cars, Martin removed Glenn from the boot, set the BMW on fire, and brought Glenn inside the guest house and handcuffed him to the stair rail. The police moved in and surrounded the area, and a standoff ensued. But first, a scene of horror and carnage in the Tasmanian town of Port Arthur tonight, where as many as 25 people have been shot dead in Australia's worst massacre. At least 15 people are wounded, and the gunman who's still holding police at bay is thought to be holding at least one person hostage. Most of the victims are reported to be tourists visiting the historic penal colony at Port Arthur. The police tried to negotiate with Martin for several hours. Martin informed them that he had 3 hostages, when in reality he had won. The police believed that David and Sally were still alive. When speaking with the negotiator, Martin consistently demanded to be provided with a helicopter to take him to Hobart Airport. From there, he wanted to be flown to Adelaide, threatening to kill his hostages if these demands were not complied with. He said that when the helicopter arrived, he intended to take Sally with him as a hostage and release the others. "It's Terry again? How are you?" "I'm fine. How's things going in there, mate?" "Fine. Couldn't be better. Just like on a Hawaiian holiday." "Hawaiian holiday?" "Yes, that's correct, sir." "Oh, I'm sorry. I don't understand what you mean by that. I don't know myself." "No, I'm making up some sandwiches. These people have got salads and some bacon in there, right? Veg and eggs. I'm gonna fry up bacon and eggs for them." Hey, I've gotta go because this kettle's squealing downstairs, and I'll make a cup of tea now for the hostages." The standoff lasted throughout the night, and apart from a lull between the hours of 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. on the April 29th, Martin continued to shoot at officers from the building. Approximately 150 shots were fired at the police. At around 7:45 a.m. on the April 29th, smoke was observed coming from the building. It was soon engulfed in flames. At 8:25 a.m., Martin was seen running from the flames, removing his clothing that was on fire until he was totally naked. Martin then fell to his knees as the police rapidly moved in and arrested him. Martin was badly burned and was rushed to hospital. By the time the Port Arthur massacre came to an end, 35 people had been killed, and 23 had been injured. The flames were extinguished, and the guest house was searched. Inside the ruins of the guest house was the bodies of David and Sally Martin and Glenn. Due to the fire, their bodies had to be identified through dental records. It turned out that Glenn had been killed way before the fire had started and had been shot in the neck and stomach. After Martin was treated for his wounds, he was questioned by the police. However, he claimed he knew nothing about the shooting at Port Arthur, and claimed that at the time of the shooting he was away surfing. He told the police that he had been falsely accused and declined to participate in a video-recorded interview. For some time, Martin refused. However, his lawyer convinced him to speak. On the July 4, 1996, investigators conducted an interview with Martin. The transcript of this interview is available online if you search for it. During the course of this interview, which was recorded, Martin admitted that he owned the AR-15 that was used in the massacre, and admitted to kidnapping a male person and ordering him at gunpoint into the boot of the BMW, and then driving the vehicle to Seascape and subsequently setting it on fire. However, at all times throughout the interview, he insisted that he never went to Port Arthur on the April 28th, or that he had shot any person. Although, at the end of the interview, he accidentally slips up. I shall now play you the clip. As you can see, Martin thought he was being clever and thought the cameras were off, but they weren't. For mental health professionals assessed Martin's psychological condition. All agreed that Martin was suffering from a significant personality disorder, but he was not insane. And although Martin had an IQ of 66, his intelligence did not imply that he was sufficiently impaired to satisfy the criteria of diminished responsibility. Martin's lawyer, John Avery, tried to convince Martin that if the case went to trial, they would reach an obvious guilty verdict. Martin then decided to plead guilty to the murders, but not guilty to the multiple charges of attempted murder over those he injured. It's believed he did this to see his victims in court. This, however, would never happen, as on the November 7th, Martin officially pleaded guilty to 72 charges including murder, attempted murder, grievous bodily harm, kidnap, and arson. Martin's lawyer said to go to trial would have been absolute stupidity, but it also involved having all these witnesses, damaged people, come to court and give evidence where the outcome was always inevitable. What he wanted was to see the people he'd so grievously maimed to come to court and say it was him. He wanted to be the center of attention. Martin told his lawyer to offer no explanation for the massacre, and to this day, Martin still has not given a reason. Martin was handed down 35 life sentences, plus 1,652 years without parole. The Port Arthur massacre is the third deadliest mass shooting in history committed by a lone gunman, and the name Martin Bryant is incredibly infamous in Australia. An excerpt from the court documents reads as follows. For those who lost family members or friends, the nature of the impact of the crime include emotional, social, physical, and financial harm. The emotional impact ranges from sadness and disbelief to anger and bitterness to extreme grief. Some are considering ending their lives. Some have been prescribed antidepressant medication and sleeping tablets. The families of the victims have expressed feelings of powerlessness and frustration, feelings of loss for even those surviving members whose lives have fallen apart. They have described their lives as being totally destroyed. Many complained of loneliness and feeling trapped. Many who were also at Port Arthur with their now deceased loved ones suffer with reoccurring nightmares and flashbacks. This tragedy has also impacted upon people's social existence. Some victims have said they feel isolated, and they have feelings of not being loved, of being socially insecure, and some point to describing themselves as agoraphobic. Many find that they are easily prompted into a bout of uncontrollable crying, and some have said they experience feelings of guilt when enjoying life. Some have increased or started smoking and increased their alcohol consumption, and many families and friends of deceased victims are receiving ongoing counseling. The names of the victims who were killed that day are on screen now, along with their ages. As a result of the massacre, a number of changes happened in Australia. Gun laws were amended and a buyback scheme was rolled out. 650,000 guns were brought in and destroyed. Those who brought in guns were compensated monetarily. The buyback cost was $304 million in compensation and $63 million in administration. There are some people who believe that Martin is innocent and that he was framed, pointing to the fact that there was no trial, and also claiming that none of Martin's DNA evidence was found at the crime scene. There are also claims that several witnesses did not identify Martin as the shooter. They also find it hard to believe that a man with an IQ of 66 was capable of committing such an attack. Many of the victims were killed with headshots, so the claim is that whoever had done this would have had tactical training. However, it's likely that Martin had such high accuracy due to being in the small cafe that was filled with people. Because it was so crowded, he was able to walk up to people and shoot them at close range. The people who think Martin is innocent believe the government carried out the attack to take away guns, and blamed it on Martin due to his eccentric nature and because of his low IQ, as he would be an easy target to pin the crime on. It's important to remember that Martin did indeed admit to carrying out the massacre when he thought he was not being filmed. It's likely he denied committing the murders to toy with the police. Martin's mother, Caroline, did also believe this at one point too. She believed her son to be innocent, which I guess is understandable. Nobody would ever want to think their son was capable of such a crime. However, it's now reported that she does believe her son is the one responsible for the massacre. As for Martin now, he is almost unrecognizable. In around February 2007, he was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. And inside prison, he is commonly called Porky Pig due to his weight. It's reported that he now weighs in excess of 160 kilograms due to the medication he is taking, and because he is known to perform acts on prisoners in exchange for chocolate and packets of noodles. The Port Arthur massacre is without a doubt one of the most tragic cases I have ever covered. Seeing the crime scenes and reading through the court documents was truly horrific. Walter Mychak, the man who lost his wife and children that day, set up a charity in their honor. Her link will be pinned in the comments. To this day, the Port Arthur massacre remains the worst mass shooting in Australian history. A man looked out of his window and saw one of his neighbors in a frantic state. He rushed out to see what was wrong. The young man said that something was wrong with his family members. The man went inside the house to see what was wrong. He walked into the bedroom of a woman named Jennifer, and there, he saw a sight that would scar him for life. The investigators would later say that the murder scene was so disturbing and gruesome, it left them traumatized and led some of them to retire early. This case takes place near Wollongong, New South Wales, Australia, on the March 12, 1996. The man left the house and comforted the 18-year-old, who seemed to be in a serious amount of distress. The teenager's name was Matthew DeGruchy. The emergency services soon arrived and Matthew was in such a bad state after what he saw that he was taken to hospital after he collapsed from stress. Inside that house was Jennifer DeGruchy. She was a 41-year-old woman and the mother to Matthew. Her lifeless body was found laying in her bed. The sheets were saturated with her blood. Someone had entered the room while she slept, looked down on her, placed a pillow over her head, and used a weapon to bash her in the head. Jennifer suffered extreme head and facial injuries, so extreme that the coroner required blood samples to identify her body. She had been hit so hard and so many times that her head had been completely caved in and her actual brain was seeping out of the cracks in her skull and had spilled onto the pillow too. But tragically, she wasn't the only victim in this. As the police went through the house, they found two other victims. Sarah DeGruchy, Matthew's sister, who was only 13 years old. She had suffered the same fate as her mother, but the attacker was not as ferocious. She was found in her bedroom with extreme head and facial injuries. It appeared that she actually saw the attacker enter the room and anticipated the attack, as she had bruising on her arms that showed she had tried to defend herself and tried to block the violent blows. But this ruthless killer was persistent. She would have suffered a truly terrifying end trying to save herself. And then there was Adrian, Matthew's brother, who was only 15 years old. The police discovered him dead in the garage. It seemed that he was fixing a chair in the garage and someone had creeped up behind him and attacked. He was lying in a pool of his own blood. Someone had hit him in the head with a blunt instrument 21 times in a disturbing frenzy. And the killer had done this in such a ferocious way that blood was splattered all over the walls and his teeth had been scattered all around the garage. He had around 30 injuries to his face, neck, and body, and he was doused in petrol. Whoever had killed these three innocent people had caved their heads in so violently that the police said they resembled plane crush victims. After Matthew left the hospital, he spoke with the investigators right away, and he told them that he had come home to find the disturbing scene after spending the night with his girlfriend. Matthew's father Wayne was a suspect at the start, as these kinds of cases tend to be someone the victim knew. But he was away in Sydney staying at his parents' house and playing golf with some friends on the night of the murder. Sydney is around an hour and a half away from Wollongong, and he was ruled out as a suspect almost immediately after people there had confirmed his alibi. The approximate time the victims were killed did not match the times where he was confirmed to have been in Sydney. The investigators were baffled. At first, it seemed like some kind of robbery that had gone wrong. But soon, the police would quickly piece together what really happened here. The investigation was soon underway, and the police managed to discover what the murder weapon could have been. They believed it could have been a sledgehammer or a wheel brace. The bruising on the bodies was quite unique and indicated that it was more than likely a wheel brace that was used. Matthew was also a potential suspect, but he had been at his girlfriend's on the night of the murder. But the police were still a little suspicious about him, as he was able to give a list of items that were missing from the house. The police found it quite odd that he was able to identify the missing items. Investigators then checked the house for clues. The crime scene had some strange aspects. For instance, the killer had cut up large parts of the carpet. They suspected that the attacker must have been hurt or injured during the attack, and that he could have possibly left traces of blood on the carpet, which he had to cut up to remove evidence. It appeared that somebody had attempted to scrub the house clean too. But some small bloodstains were found at the murder scene, including a small bloody spot near Jennifer's bed, and the DNA matched with Matthew's. The police checked Jennifer's car to see if the wheel brace matched the injuries on the victims' bodies. But there was no inside, which was strange, as the car was fairly new, and the spare tire had not been used. They contacted their car manufacturer and managed to get an identical one sent to them, and it seemed to match up with the injuries. Matthew was known to use the vehicle. In fact, it had been causing some problems between him and his mother, as she was unhappy with the amount of miles that he had accumulated on the car. When the police inspected the car, they also found a small carpet fiber that matched the carpet from Jennifer's room that was ripped up, and on that fiber was blood. Further DNA tests concluded that the blood was that of Matthew's. Matthew did indeed spend the night at his girlfriend's house, but the police would soon discover that he didn't arrive there until 11 p.m. that night. His girlfriend had been expecting him to arrive a couple of hours earlier at around 8 p.m. But he told her that someone had been calling the house saying that they were going to come over and kill everyone in their house. His mother was scared and asked him to stay at the house for just a little bit longer. The police also asked his girlfriend if he had any injuries when she saw him. As if he did, it would be a perfect explanation for the carpet being ripped up and the blood on the carpet fiber found in their car and the blood splat near Jennifer's bed. But she said there was no such injury or cut on his body. The police were confused by the phone call excuse that he had used as the reason why he was late to the house, as Matthew had not mentioned anything about the calls to them during the investigation. And surely, this would be a crucial piece of information and something you would want to bring up almost right away. The police brought him back in and questioned him further, and he confirmed to them that he did receive the calls. So, the police decided to double-check, and they went through the phone records from the DeGruchy household, only to discover that Matthew had lied. No such calls were ever made. When confronted with the fact that these calls never took place, Matthew became a little suspicious during the interview and didn't seem to answer the questions clearly. This is an electronic recorded interview between Detective Sergeant DJ Sharkey and Matthew Wayne DeGruchy. When the call's made, I was just trying to clarify myself. Phone rings. You pick the phone off out of the cradle. How long a time after pick the phone up does the line stay open? When it just hit the pins. So are you saying that they hang up soon as you pick the phone up? Is that what happens? Well, as soon as you pick the phone up to put it to your ear, you just hear the beeps. A couple of weeks later, after the murders had taken place, the police discovered a sports bag in a reservoir containing the items from the house that Matthew said had been stolen. And they also found the missing pieces of carpet that were cut up from the DeGruchy household. There was also a note inside the bag too, but it had been torn up. When the police pieced it together, it turned out to be some kind of list with instructions that included open gate, open blinds, knife 1, have shower, hit arm with pole, hit leg with pole, cut self with knife. Adrian, Sarah, Mom. The police then analyzed and cross-referenced the note with Matthew's handwriting, and they confirmed that this was indeed Matthew's handwriting. The police also found out that some young boys had found the bag previously, and inside they had found a hammer which they took and kept. But, of course, they had no interest in pieces of carpet, so they threw the bag back into the reservoir. They kept the hammer and they messed around with it for a little bit. But at some point they lost it, and the hammer has never been found. 3 months after the brutal murder of his family, Matthew was charged on suspicion of triple homicide. All the evidence seemed to be pointing in one direction. The carpet fiber in the car with Matthew's blood and the to-do list were 2 crucial pieces of information that were used against Matthew. The police had come up with a theory as to how the blood had gotten on the wall and on the carpet. They theorized that Matthew was under so much stress and pressure and had exerted so much energy when attacking his family that he likely had a nosebleed that dripped onto the carpet, which is why he ripped it up and tried to hide it and why he had to clean the floors of the house. Matthew was found guilty of killing his mother, sister, and brother. The evidence against Matthew was overwhelming. He was sentenced to 21 to 28 years in prison. And now, the man who killed his own siblings and smashed his own mother's skull to pieces to the point where she was no longer recognizable and had brain matter spilling out of her head is now free. He was released in 2019. The now 43-year-old man was deemed fit for release by the New South Wales Parole Board. He was 41 years old when he was released, the same age as his mother when he took her life. His extended family have repeatedly argued that he should never be released. But strangely enough, Wayne DeGruchy, Matthew's father, described Matthew as a gentle, loving boy and doesn't believe that he killed his family in this incredibly gruesome way. Matthew has been told to seek immediate help from the parole board if he has any troubles adjusting on the outside again. One of the conditions is that he is required to undergo constant psychological counseling. One of the investigators in the case commented about his release, and she said he is a sociopath. I saw the damage he did to those bodies and their faces. He wrote notes, disposed of evidence, and never ever admitted or showed any remorse. I'm really worried. I don't think he should be let out at all. I think he's a very dangerous person. Another investigator said he was small in stature, quiet, but he had this vibe about him, some sort of silent evil. If he gets out, I hope someone is watching him very, very closely. The investigators believed the murders were because of arguments with his mother about taking the car to his girlfriend's house. It's believed that Matthew flipped and sought revenge and killed his siblings in a plan to make it look like someone else had killed them. What Matthew did to his own mother and siblings left me nearly lost for words. Matthew has never admitted to the murders and has maintained his innocence. And like I said, his father believes him to be innocent too. Matthew is now living in Tasmania in his father's house, and I'd be curious to know if his father sleeps with one eye open. This case takes place in Sydney, Australia in the year 1988. In 1986, the country of Australia was outraged by the brutal death of Anita Cobby. Anita was walking home from a night out when she was kidnapped near a quiet train station by a number of men who pulled her into the car and then dragged her into a field. These men then committed what is considered to be one of the very worst crimes in Australian history. The murder of Anita was horrendous and especially cruel. There are even rumors that much of what happened to her was suppressed by the media and police as to not anger and disturb the country more than they already were. Some of you may be familiar with this case as I did cover it just a few months ago. Australia hoped that no such case would ever happen again. But just 2 years later, a similar case would take place. Yet again, sparking outrage and galvanizing the public to seek justice for the victim. Janine Balding was a 20-year-old woman who lived in Sydney, New South Wales. Janine was born on the October 7, 1967. She was raised in Wagga Wagga, New South Wales, which at the time had a population of around 40,000. Janine had a happy upbringing. She was close with her mother and father, and she had 3 other siblings. Her parents would later recall Janine in her younger years. They said they couldn't remember a time when she wasn't smiling. They said their daughter was incredibly happy and bubbly, and had a number of loyal and close friends in her youth. Janine enjoyed her time in Wagga Wagga. But as she got older, she wanted something more exciting. She wanted to move to a bigger city. Janine's older sister had been living in Sydney for a few years, and Janine desperately wanted to move and join a city that had more going on. So when she finished her studies, she made the decision to move with the full support of her friends and family. Janine's sister was living in the family's holiday home, right by the ocean in Cronulla, so Janine already had a place lined up to live. She arrived in Sydney and began looking for a job. And fairly quickly, she was able to find employment with a bank on George Street, one of Sydney's busiest streets. Not long after moving to Sydney, Janine met a man by the name of Stephen Moran. The two hit it off right away, and they began a relationship. Things were going so well, in fact, that the two became engaged. Her family would later recall that she was incredibly excited about this new chapter of her life. The two bought their own house together in Berkeley Vale. The couple spent a good chunk of their savings on purchasing the property, so they planned to rent out the home until their wedding day as a means to finance their wedding. And once they were married, the two would move in together and begin their own family. But until that day came, Janine stayed living in Sydney with her sister. On the morning of the September 8, 1988, Janine made her way to work. She had stayed in her fiancé's house the night before, so she drove to Sutherland Station and left her car in the car park and took the train into Sydney to work. This decision would soon result in her untimely death. As on this day, a gang of thugs created horrific plans to abduct someone in that very station. This gang included Matthew Elliott, a 16-year-old who was described as an uncontrollable youth, who ran away from his home in the western suburbs of Sydney. He had spent the vast majority of his teenage years in and out of institutions, and not for minor crimes. He had an extensive criminal record for someone of his age. This included arson, breaking and entering, assault, and theft. Another was 22-year-old Shorty Jameson. Shorty had the mental capacity of a 10-year-old. And he too had an extensive criminal record including SA, malicious wounding, and robbery. Then there was Bronson Blessington, 14. He left his home when he was around 9 and spent most of his time on the streets of Sydney. He was often in trouble with the police for petty thefts. And finally, there was Wayne Wilmot, who was 15. He had a criminal record when he was still in the single digits. His criminal record included dozens of essays, assaults, stealing, and theft. He had been placed into various foster homes, but he just preferred to live on the streets. Wayne also had a girlfriend, 15-year-old Carol Arrow. She had run away from her country home too, and she had stopped in Sydney. Carol had learning difficulties, and she would often associate with people who would take advantage of her. On the morning of the September 8, 1988, the gang all met up and began talking about the crimes each of them had committed, bragging about which one had committed the worst act. Then Bronson uttered some of the most vile words I have ever covered on the channel. He said, "Let's go get a Ciela and a pear." Of course, the usual reaction to such a suggestion would be disgust. But not for this gang. They actually believed this to be a good idea. None of them thought much about the moral implications of such a vile act, and they agreed to set out and do their best to bring the idea into fruition. As I mentioned earlier, the murder of Anita Cabby was still in the minds of many in Sydney, and it was in the minds of this gang. They knew that the best opportunity they would have would be to target a lone woman near a train station in the dead of night, just like what happened to Anita Cabby. So the gang made their way from Central Station to Sutherland Railway Station, the place where Janine had parked her car earlier that day. This particular spot would be a criminal's dream. It had parking spots in secluded areas that would be out of view from the public. During the train journey to Sutherland Station, the gang attempted to intimidate other passengers. They threatened a number of students on the train, telling them that if they did not give up their seats, they would smash their heads in. Shorty Jameson even found a lone woman on the train and tried his best to make her feel as uncomfortable as possible. He kept showing her an adult magazine and repeated vulgar phrases to her. The gang finally reached their destination at around 5 p.m. They waited at the station to find a victim, and it wouldn't be long until they did. 19-year-old Christine had just arrived to the car park right alongside the station. She walked towards her vehicle and searched her bag for her car keys. She opened the door, but just before she would get inside, she heard a noise. She turned around to see one of the gang members standing there, looking rather suspicious. She got into her car as the gang members approached. One of them asked Christine what the time was, and she replied 20 past 5. Christine knew that something was off. She became worried as flashbacks of Anita's murder came to mind. She locked her car doors and began driving out of the parking lot. But as she did, one of the gang stepped in front of her car to make Christine stop. He walked down the side of the car and asked Christine for some money. But as he asked this, Christine spotted a knife in his hand that he was trying to hide. Christine wasted no time. She sped away and got home as quickly as she could. She was terrified and wondered what exactly she had just escaped from. She arrived home in a frantic state and told her fiancé everything that had just occurred. Her fiancé was deeply worried and suggested they go to the police right away and inform them of what had happened. So they drove to the police station and gave a statement to some officers. The officers said that they would look into the matter, but they didn't dispatch any officers to the location. The couple left somewhat disappointed in the lack of urgency shown by the police. So they decided to drive by the station on their way home to see if the gang was still there. Around this time, Janine had just arrived at the car park and was heading to her car. Christine and her fiancé pulled up at the station to see Janine in her recognizable bank uniform being accosted by the gang. Christine's fiancé had a badly broken leg. He was in no condition to fight off four males, especially knowing that at least one of them had a knife. They decided that the best thing to do would be to drive as quickly as possible back to the police station and inform them that the gang was still operating in the area and had a potential victim. Christine and her fiancé turned the car around and headed straight back to the station. The police immediately dispatched a number of officers to the scene, and Christine and her fiancé followed closely behind. But by the time they got there, the gang and Janine were gone. As Janine had tried to walk to her car, the gang attacked her. They forced her into the back seat of her own car and quickly drove away from the scene. In the back seat of the car, Matthew Elliott forced himself upon Janine, as Bronson held a knife to her throat and threatened her not to fight back. Shorty also did his part in holding pleas for mercy. In the driver's seat was Wayne Wilmot, and in the front passenger seat was Carol. Upon hearing the chilling screams and pleas, Wayne told Carol to perform an act upon him. Amidst the attack, Taro pulled out Wayne's privates and did as she was told. The three others in the back took turns committing vile acts upon Janine. Using the knife, Elliot sliced off Janine's clothing and threatened that he would cut her if she tried to do anything. They stuffed Janine's clothing into her mouth, so she wouldn't be able to make as much noise. They drove Janine's car for nearly an hour into the western suburbs, with each minute being described in court as hell on earth for Janine, as she was beaten and repeatedly essayed at knife point. One of the gang then said, "It's a nice night for a murder." They all began laughing and joking that they should kill her. One of the boys then suggested a location that he knew of that would be quiet, and that this would be the perfect spot to kill Janine without anyone seeing. He suggested a small dam near the main road that they were driving on. The gang pulled up at the area where the dam was located. Bronson, Shorty, and Matthew dragged Janine towards the water. She tried her best to resist and fight them, but she was powerless against 3 males. Janine was pushed over a fence, where she broke her wrist quite badly, making it even harder to fight back. Meanwhile, Wayne and Carol stayed in the car and continued to do what they were doing before. They had little interest in the fate of Janine and just how much she was suffering. The 3 others dragged Janine out of the sight of any potential passers-by or cars, and they continued to essay her again. Janine screamed out, so one of them grabbed her scarf and used it to silence her as the rest of her clothing was removed. After the 3 felt as if they were done with Janine, they realized that if they were to let her go, she would be able to tell the police everything, and they would be caught. They all agreed that they needed to kill Janine. One of them went back to the car, whilst the other 2 guarded Janine so she couldn't escape. They looked inside Janine's calf at anything they could use to kill her. They found some rope and then returned to Janine and the 2 others. The 3 hog-tied her. Janine's feet were tied together, and then the rope was wrapped around her neck and tightened so that her knees were under her chin. The rope was then wrapped under her knees again and pulled even tighter. The position would have been extremely painful and made it very hard to breathe. Janine was then dragged into the waters of the dam and drowned. The gang would later recall that it took some time for her to finally pass away. But once they knew she was dead, they decided to take all of her jewelry, including her engagement ring. They also looked in Janine's purse and found her bank cards, along with a piece of paper with all of her PIN numbers written on it. The 3 rejoined Carol and Wayne in Janine's car, and they drove away from the horrendous crime scene. But as they were making their getaway, Janine's car broke down. The gang abandoned it on the side of the road and walked the rest of the way. The gang then used Janine's cards to withdraw hundreds of dollars, and they shared it amongst themselves. Now on this night, Janine was supposed to be staying at her fiancé's home, as that's why she had parked in the station that she had been abducted in. When she didn't return home as planned, Steve thought little about this. He simply believed that she had finished late, or that she had made other plans, had stayed with her sister for the night. The following day, the police received a phone call. Someone had spotted what appeared to be an abandoned car. Officers were dispatched to the location, and what they found raised some suspicion. There was evidence that something was horribly wrong. Underwear were found in the back seat, and not far from the car was a handbag, which appeared to have been ransacked. The car's registration was linked to Janine's name, so they decided to call Janine's place of residence to see if she was okay. Janine's sister had been staying at her boyfriend's home that night, so she had no idea if her sister had made it home the night before. She quickly checked the flat they shared, but Janine was nowhere to be seen. They contacted her fiancé Stephen, who told the police that he had not seen her either, but that she was supposed to come back to his place the night before, but he assumed she had just made other plans. Officers then discovered that Janine didn't make it into work. Janine's parents were contacted back in Wagga Wagga, and they were asked if they had seen Janine, but they too had not. It was clear that something horrible had happened, and Janine was reported missing. An investigator was assigned to the disappearance, the very same lead investigator who had worked on the case of Anita Kobe. Although, it wouldn't take long to find the twisted individuals who were responsible for her death. The very same evening that Janine was reported missing, Matthew and Bronson were arrested by police. A social worker at the homeless accommodation they were staying in overheard the boys talking about a car they had stolen. The police were immediately called, and the 2 boys were arrested. They were questioned by investigators, but initially, the boys were only going to be questioned about the carjacking. But as soon as the officers sat them down, one of the boys pulled out of his pocket a switchblade knife and told officers that they had information on a missing woman. The two boys concocted a tale that some of their friends had murdered a young woman, and they said they could show the officers where the body was. The investigators took the boys up on their offer. They hopped into a vehicle and made their way to the dam where Janine had been murdered. And there they found the horrific crime scene. Janine's family were called, and they were told the devastating news. But Janine's mother and father wanted to make sure it was really her. They went to the morgue and confirmed their worst fears. The body was indeed their beloved daughter. It goes without saying that the family were distraught with grief. They just couldn't figure out why anyone would want to harm Janine. She had no enemies, and she was friendly to everyone she met. Now, this is something that I found to be incredibly touching. Janine's family were about to enter a nightmare that another family were all too familiar with. Anita Covey's parents Gary and Grace couldn't bear the thought of someone else having to go through what they went through with no guidance. They decided to reach out to Janine's family and offered them some much-needed support. They told them what to expect in the coming days, how to navigate the relentless media, and how the court proceedings would work. Gary and Grace were with the family every step of the way, something that gave them some much-needed comfort in such horrific times. Janine's family were incredibly grateful to just have some people who truly understood what they were going through. Meanwhile, Matthew and Bronson were being questioned further, and they provided true details of the killers and kidnappers. A warrant was issued for Carol Arrow and Wayne Wilmot. The couple were quickly found in King's Cross, and they were arrested. Nationwide manhunt was conducted looking for Shorty. Shorty Jameson is a rather odd-looking individual and stands out amongst a crowd. His mother had consumed alcohol and illegal substances before he was born, and they severely impacted him. He was quickly found and arrested in Queensland. All five were questioned about the murder. They all gave a similar story, but they all denied being the one who actually killed Janine. They all claimed that an individual by the name of Scott Aggies was the one who truly was responsible for the murder. They all murder. Scott was arrested and questioned by the police. He denied any involvement and seemed to be genuinely confused. He was able to provide a solid alibi. He had been with a number of social workers when the crime occurred, and this was confirmed. Scott was released by the officers when they became convinced that he played no role whatsoever. The evidence for the other five being involved was overwhelming. At this time, DNA evidence was still in its infancy. The United Kingdom was one of the leaders in this technology. So samples were taken of the five and was sent off to the UK to be tested. The DNA evidence found in Sargeen implicated Bronson and Matthew, but not Shorty. A number of witnesses came forward and remembered seeing the gang covered in dirt and mud. They were using a bank card to withdraw money at the time. Christine, the first woman to be harassed by the gang, was brought in as a witness. She was immediately able to pick out a number of the gang members in a police lineup. Wayne and Carol's fingerprints were found in Janine's car, linking them to the crime. The knife used in the attack was also traced to a shop. The owner of the shop was shown images of the gang, and he was able to identify Matthew as the one who purchased the blade. And when Carol was arrested, she was found to be wearing Janine's watch. Despite having no DNA evidence against Shorty, plenty of witnesses came forward, and they distinctly remembered seeing him with the gang before and after the murder. He was picked out numerous times. When Christine had heard the news about Janine, she was distraught. She beat herself up, believing that she should have done more to save her. But Janine's parents assured her that she had nothing to be sorry for, and that she did everything she could by alerting the police. The trial would soon begin. Janine's mother Beverly bravely said that she would attend every single day of the trial. She wanted to know exactly what these monsters had done to her daughter. The court was presented with the horrific details of the crime. How Janine begged to be saved, how she tried to fight back, and how she was essayed multiple times at knife point. Beverly heard it all in what I can imagine must have been unbelievably traumatic. As the details of the case were read out, the gang began to laugh, and they made a number of jokes. They would often shout out and jeer as the jury and the rest of the court looked at them in pure disgust. But the trial would soon have to be put to an end temporarily, causing much stress to the family. The gang decided to change their story and claimed that Shorty Jameson wasn't actually present at the murder, and that it was actually another person who was also called Shorty. They identified another homeless man named Mark Shorty Wells as their accomplice. Mark Shorty Wells was a schizophrenic and a self-described Satanist. He was tracked down in Brisbane more than a year after the murder. In court, it became clear that he knew some of the details of the murder, but he said that the reason he knew these details was because he had a dream during a seance. Eventually, Mark Shorty Wells was acquitted of any wrongdoing, and the second trial was now to be held. However, before this happened, the charges against Carol Arrow were dropped as she was found to have serious mental deficiencies. When Wilmot entered a plea, as the police accepted that he stayed in the car with Carol during the time of the murder, he was sentenced to 10 years. Evidence cementing Shorty Jameson's involvement in the crime was brought before the court. He had bragged to another prisoner about the crime, stating that he would do it again if he was ever given the chance. This prisoner testified against him in court. Stephen Shorty Jameson, Matthew Elliott, and Bronson Blessington were all found guilty of the murder of Janine Balding. The public were furious. They wanted the death sentence for all three, or at least life without parole. And the public got what they wanted. All three were sentenced to life without the possibility of ever being released. The killers, even to this day, do their best to appeal the sentence. Beverly attended every single appeal, and did her best to ensure that these monsters who killed her daughter would never, under any circumstances, ever be released. Wayne Wilmond, who was given 10 years, was let out after serving 7 years. He would go on to essay another further for women, and was sentenced to for these crimes. He was ordered to attend a course to show the damage SA has done to people. But during this course, he exposed himself to a nurse, and tried to attack his therapist after he told the therapist that Janine got what she deserved. Wayne is one of the few people in Australian history not to have been convicted of murder, but still deemed far too dangerous to ever be released. In 2019, psychological assessments were conducted on Wayne. He was found to have an IQ of just 74. He was found to be highly callous, manipulative, and deceptive, traits consistent with a psychopath. The others still remain in prison, where hopefully they will stay until their final days. However, Bronson insists he is a changed man and that he has found God. He has been speaking and writing to an Anglican minister named Simon Manchester every week for the past 12 years. Reverend Manchester believes that he is now rehabilitated, and is deeply remorseful for his part in the murder of Janine. The Reverend said in an interview, "I think that what he did was horrendous. And if I was the Balding family, I don't know how I would cope. But I have observed him for over 12 years, and he is a genuine believer." Despite the claims that Bronson has turned his life around, the Balding family have never received an apology from him. Janine's brother doesn't believe for 1 second that Bronson is genuinely changed, and went on to say about his religious conversion, "If he thinks he's going to the same heaven as my sister, he's mistaken." The case of Janine Balding shook Australia to its core, much like the case of Anita Cobby. It can't be understated just how much of a hero Janine's mother Beverly is. Despite it being incredibly painful, she fought to the end of her days to make sure justice was kept for her daughter, attending every hearing and appeal, and helping to push the legislation to prevent such criminals from ever being released. Beverly passed away in 2015. She is buried alongside her beloved daughter, Janine. You may think you have seen this case on my channel before with the case of Mr. Cruel. However, this is very much a different story, but with some similar themes. This case takes place in Australia between the years of 1979 and 1980. On the December 10, 1979, a man who called himself Mark Chapman walked into a gun store in Burleigh Head and purchased a Glenfield .22 caliber rifle. Whoever this man was, Mark Chapman was not his real name. He left the store with the weapon after providing an address where he claimed to live, although he had faked his place of residency too. And just 5 days later, this so-called Mark Chapman would use the weapon in a series of disturbing crimes. On the December 15, 1979, in the scenic paradise that is the Gold Coast, a woman was abducted at gunpoint from her home. She was reading when a man wearing a balaclava broke in and forced her to get into the back of her car. He then drove them to the Gold Coast hinterlands, and once arriving in a secluded location, this masterman forced himself upon the woman in the back seat of the car. After this twisted crime, he then forced her into the boot of the vehicle, drove to a beach, and left. The hot summer sun was beating down, leaving the woman trapped in an intensely hot car with no way to get out. Thankfully, she was rescued when passers-by heard her screams and were able to take her to safety. The incident was reported to the police, where the woman gave a description of the man who was wearing a balaclava at the time, and police got to work right away to find the culprit. The investigators had a strong feeling that the masked man would strike again, and just 2 weeks later he would. In Cabarita on the December 24, 1979, the very same man ambushed a couple in their parked car. At gunpoint, the masked man SAD the woman in front of her boyfriend as he was forced to watch. After the attack was over, the masked man apologized and fled from the scene. The following day in Cabarita, another couple were attacked inside their car by a man wearing a balaclava. The woman was forced to bind her husband's hands. Once he was clear that they were now dealing with a serial attacker. Every victim described the attacker the same way, an athletic man with steely blue eyes and bushy eyebrows. They also claimed that he smelled of motor oil. What struck the investigators as incredibly strange is that despite committing the most heinous of crimes, the masked man always was polite to the victims and would even go as far as to apologize to them. And on the December 28, 1979, another couple were attacked in their farmhouse. The woman was ordered to tape her partner's hands, and then she was essayed in his presence. And then in the new year, another couple were attacked. On the January 25, 1980, whilst home together, the masked man broke in. And like the previous attack, the man told the woman to bind her husband's hands, which she agreed to do. However, before anything further would happen, the woman cried and pleaded with the masked man not to hurt them. She informed him that she was pregnant. Upon hearing this, the masked man apologized, and he quickly left the scene. The police worked to find the man responsible before he could strike again, but they just couldn't find the culprit. News about the masked man spread, creating a great sense of fear throughout Australia, with the police knowing it was just a matter of time until he would strike again. In Tweed Heads, on the February 2, 1980, a couple were in a car together. They were on a date, and at around 1:30 a.m., 33-year-old Jeff Parkinson opened the passenger door for his girlfriend, when all of a sudden, the masked man appeared. He jumped into the back seat of the car with the rifle in his hand and demanded they drive to a secluded location. The masked man did his usual thing, telling the woman to tie up Jeff. But Jeff decided to fight back. Jeff lunged towards the masked man, and a fight ensued. Jeff turned to his girlfriend and told her to run, and so she did. Jeff fought on as she fled from the scene, looking for help. The woman was able to flag down a man who happened to be driving by. But as the man pulled over, gunshots were heard in the distance. The police were called, and they arrived on the scene. An officer recalls that day. I remember going there that night, and the scene was eerie. The woman was absolutely distraught. The officers found Jeff dead with 3 gunshot wounds. The masked man was now a murderer. The officer went on to say, "We'd known about him for a long time, but this was the first time he resorted to murder." Seeing Jeff's body next to the car alongside a quiet creek, I just said to myself, I've got to get this monster behind bars. And with this, the case of the Balaclava killer became one of the biggest manhunts in Australian history. He would strike again later that year. A woman in the Gold Coast was home alone in her flat on the October 31st, 1980. The Balaclava killer broke into her apartment and forced himself upon her before fleeing on a motorbike. After this attack, he disappeared, never to be seen again. The attacks launched a huge investigation. Due to the last attack, over 5,000 motorcyclists in the area where the attacks had occurred were interviewed by the police, and DNA was taken from hundreds of potential suspects. Despite their best efforts, the police still couldn't find the masked man. Investigators managed to track down the gun they believed was used by the Balaclava killer and traced it to a gun shop at West Burleigh. The owner of the gun shop pulled up the records. And as I said earlier, the masked man had used the name Mark Chapman and had given a fake address. They had no way of finding him. The shop owner saw the man's face and described him looking similar to how the victims described him from what they could see through his homemade balaclava. He had the same eyes and hair color. But sadly, nothing else came from this information. And over the years, the case went cold and was closed. In February 2008, the case was reopened. DNA evidence was reviewed by police in hopes of solving the string of disturbing crimes, but their efforts proved to be unsuccessful. The lead investigator who attempted to track down the balaclava killer says that he often loses sleep over the fact he never found the monster. There is one theory as to who the balaclava killer could be: a despicable man named Ashley Colston. Ashley is an Australian triple murderer who is currently serving 3 sentences of life imprisonment for killing 3 people in Melbourne. In 1992. Now here is where things get rather strange. The balaclava killer stopped abruptly in the 1980s, which is when Ashley moved to Sydney. Ashley also owned a black motorbike and was known to frequent the area where the attacks took place. Ashley also shares a rare blood type with a person believed to be responsible for the crimes of the balaclava killer. And not only this, Ashley also had a .22 caliber rifle, the one that the balaclava killer would use in his attacks. He even bought the weapon with a fake name. At some point in the late 80s, Ashley traveled to Melbourne, and it's in the 80s in Melbourne when Mr. Krull began his reign of terror. Mr. Krull is the name given to an unidentified Australian killer who attacked 3 girls and murdered one in Melbourne in the late 80s and early 1990s before abruptly stopping. He was known to wear a balaclava during these attacks, and the police actually believed that the balaclava killer may have moved to Melbourne in the 80s. Mr. Krull began his attacks in the 1980s and abruptly stopped in 1991, and Ashley Colston was arrested in 1992. Neither Mr. Krull nor the balaclava killer have committed any further crimes since Colston's arrest. Whether or not Ashley is the balaclava killer and or Mr. Krull remains open to speculation, but many have refuted these claims. According to the Gold Coast Bulletin, the former Assistant Police Commissioner, Eric Strong, said that he had no doubt that the balaclava killer was imprisoned for other crimes. The crimes still haunt him to this day. He said when he gets a quiet moment, he thinks about the attacks and the murder committed by the balaclava killer. He says, "It's stuck with me for all of these years. He's the one that got away." The fellow has probably been captured in another state and is serving time there for murders, but I don't have that assurance. I fear that he hasn't phased up to the justice he deserves. He would have to be in jail because he'd still be attacking. We'd still be hearing about the balaclava killer. The terrifying case of the balaclava killer is still no closer to being solved. Not even a $50,000 reward has helped the police solve the crime. And he remains one of the most wanted men in Australia. That is, if he is still out there. This case takes place in Australia in the year 1989. I have delved into numerous cases of serial killers from down under, finding them to be some of the most chilling and disturbing cases worldwide. However, this particular case stands out, not only due to its gruesome nature, but also because of the specific demographic targeted by the perpetrator. John Wayne Glover was born to his mother, Frida, on November 26, 1932. He grew up in the heart of working-class Wolverhampton, England, which at the time was known as the Black County for its dense industrial landscape dominated by iron foundries. John was raised in poverty and faced a challenging upbringing made worse by domestic disruptions caused by his mother's promiscuity, which ultimately led to his parents' divorce. By the age of 14 in 1946, John found himself drawn into a life of petty crime, committing various minor offenses, including stealing clothing and women's purses. With very little prospect in his early life, John dropped out of school and enlisted in the British Army. But his criminal history soon caught up with him, and this led to an early dismissal from his national service. In 1956, John relocated to Australia and initially settled in Melbourne. Although he lacked any formal qualifications, John struggled to find stable employment, often working low-paying jobs. And soon after arriving in Australia, he faced convictions of robbery on 2 counts in Victoria and 1 theft in New South Wales. Additionally, In 1962, he was found guilty of attacking 2 women, with each being repeatedly battered in the head and body before being shoved to the ground while John aggressively stripped them of their clothing. Fortunately, their cries for help alerted neighbors who promptly contacted the authorities. But only months later, John would strike again. A 24-year-old woman was discovered in the front yard of somebody's home. She told the police that she was returning home from a work-related meeting at 10:30 p.m. when John pursued her down a dimly lit residential street, cornering her as she attempted to flee. John had beat her unconscious. She awoke in the lawn in a state of shock. She was bleeding profusely with her garments disheveled. Despite her screams alerting the neighborhood, John had already fled the scene. Eyewitnesses reported seeing a young man escaping and entering a nearby yard, which finally led to the arrest of 29-year-old John Glover. John attributed his actions to emotional turmoil following a dispute with his girlfriend. After being apprehended, he was detained overnight before securing release on bail the following morning. However, as John attempted to leave the police station, he was intercepted by 2 investigators keen to discuss a similar assault reported weeks earlier. Initially denying involvement, John eventually confessed to the prior incident upon further inquiry, leading to him being detained again and charged. The detectives were taken aback by John's prior convictions and the extreme violence of the attacks. Despite this, he was granted a good behavior bond and placed on 3 years probation. In 1968, at the age of 36, John Glover married Gear Rawls and settled in Sydney. However, the couple would then move to Mossman to live with Gear's parents. John's relationship with Gear's mother, Essie, became very volatile. This volatility was reportedly sparked by issues with class differences. In 1976, Frida, John's mother, joined him in Australia, further complicating his relationships with women. He was now surrounded by 2 women whom he had terrible standings with, and thus, a deep-seated resentment towards women developed within him. John managed to keep a lid on his hatred towards women whilst his mother and mother-in-law were alive. However, by the late 1980s, both of them had passed away, sparking the motivation of what was to come. Despite having a wife, children, and a job as a successful pie salesman, John began to return to his old ways of attacking women and robbery. On the January 11, 1989, John spotted 84-year-old Margaret Hunter walking along peacefully on Hill Road in Mossman. He parked up his car and ensured there were no onlookers before punching her in the face. He then stole her expensive handbag and ran as she yelled at him. Subsequently, he took the stolen money and indulged in drinks and played poker machines at the Mossman RSL Club. The investigating officers categorized the incident as a mugging, summarizing that an opportunistic observer had noticed the elderly woman with money and seized the chance to strike. Mrs. Hunter emerged physically intact from the ordeal, albeit seriously bruised and shaken. Although, she was remarkably fortunate given what transpired with John Glover's subsequent victims. It was the first day of autumn, the March 1, 1989. Locals were going about their business in the safe and comfortable suburb of Mossman, where crime is almost non-existent. Gwendolyn Louise Mitchell Hill, an 82-year-old widow, was visiting the local shopping center near to where she lived. At 4 p.m., she made her way home. Walking in the opposite direction to her was John Glover. When John spotted Gwendolyn walking towards him, he walked to his parked car, retrieved a hammer from his boot, and wrapped a cloth around the head of the hammer. John followed her to the foyer of her apartment block. And just as she reached the door, John brutally attacked her, cracking her skull and many of her ribs. John then stole her purse filled with money. And whilst he was blissfully spending it on poker machines, a group of young boys found her body. Gwendolyn was barely hanging on to life. There was a large amount of blood around her head. And initially, the young chaps assumed she had fallen over. They called for an ambulance, and Gwendolyn was taken into hospital, where it became clear that she had been horrifically attacked. Tragically, her injuries were too great, and Gwendolyn would pass away in the hospital later on. An investigation was soon launched. The police discovered that she had been robbed, but they did not suspect a link to the previous robbery of Mrs. Hunter. A forensic expert conducted the post-mortem and found several injuries to the back of the head. including a laceration and a fracture along the midline. Another aspect of the attack was that Gwendolyn's underwear and tights had been removed, and her shoes were positioned neatly next to the door. Despite their intimate nature of removing underwear, there was no evidence whatsoever of SA, which initially baffled the investigators. Investigators returned to the scene of the crime to gather evidence, but it was too late. A group of good-intentioned neighbors had washed down the crime scene, thereby inadvertently washing away any evidence. Besides the spot of blood, there was little to no forensic evidence, and no murder weapon was found. The detectives were baffled. This was a brutal crime committed just meters away from the bustling Main Street in broad daylight, and adjacent a busy construction site. 2 months later, on the May 9, 1989, an 82-year-old lady named Lady Winfred Isabel Ashton was enjoying a night of lunch and bingo at the Mossman RSL Club. Following this, she walked to a nearby shopping center before heading to her nearby home. Unbeknownst to her, she was centered in the sights of John Glover. John stalked her while she walked down her driveway. All was calm in the life of Lady Ashton, until her sinister stalker was overcome with a bloodlustful rage. Lady Ashton was violently attacked, with her head being bashed against the concrete floor several times. She struggled for her life, leaving a gruesome crime scene behind. She was eventually found in the bin room. Her underwear and tights were removed, leaving her legs bare. This time, the tights were used as a weapon to strangle her, and her money had been stolen. The lack of an intimate motive confused and frustrated the police. Despite questioning everyone who lived in the area, no witnesses came forward to assist in identifying the offender. The news of this second murder drew media attention, highlighting the similarities with the Gwendolyn Hill case. In the close-knit community of Mossman, disbelief spread, as many residents struggled to accept that the perpetrator could be one of their own. The police launched an extensive search. The only lead the police had was a sighting of a person leaving the scene of Lady Ashton's murder, described as resembling an unkempt substance abuser with bad teeth. One theory arose that the culprit might be a juvenile, given the proximity of the murders to a high school. One psychologist involved in the case suggested that the perpetrator could be ex-military with a poor relationship with women. Consequently, high school students, naval personnel, and other military individuals were extensively questioned, resulting in a significant drain on police resources. Ironically, this diversion of attention proved to be advantageous for John. The elderly women in the area were understandably frightened, given the recent string of extremely violent crimes. Lady Ashton's purse was soon found in a nearby park. An onlooker saw a man leaving the purse and described him similar to how he was described before, but slightly older. While working as a pie salesman, John began preying on older women confined to their beds in nursing homes during his rounds. His first nursing home victim was 77-year-old Marjorie Mosley. He molested her on the June 6, 1989, less than a month after his last murder. He placed his hand under her nightgown, claiming that he was just adjusting her bedding. On the June 24th, John visited the Caroline Chisholm nursing home in nearby Lane Cove. There, he discreetly raised an older woman's clothing and fondled her buttocks. He then proceeded to insert his hands down the front of another woman's nightdress, caressing her breasts. He managed to flee after another one of the terrified women began to scream. Local police investigated these instances, although they were initially deemed unrelated to the Mossman murders because the police suspected a much younger man. And in these cases of SA, he was described as older. Also, whilst he may SA some older women and kill some others, he seems not to do both at the same time. 5 months would pass, and on an October afternoon, just after 4 p.m., 86-year-old widow Doris Cox was strolling along the footpath outside her apartment on Split Road in Mossman. On the other side of the road, John Glover was visiting the post office. John turned and spotted her walking. He rushed across towards her unnoticed to catch her up. As she turned into an alleyway, John grabbed her hair and smashed her head into the brick wall in a horrifically brutal attack. The attack was so vicious that she had little chance of survival. However, miraculously, Doris Cox survived the onslaught and was taken to hospital with horrific injuries. Initially, it was believed that she had fallen over. By the time doctors became suspicious and informed the police, the neighbors had already washed down the crime scene, complicating evidence collection once again. The police were excited at the prospect of interviewing a potential survivor of the serial killer. But unfortunately, Doris had no recollection of the attack. She was unaware of where she was attacked, how she was attacked, and who attacked her. As it turned out, Doris actually had dementia, to the extent that when a mirror was held up to her face so she could observe her injuries, she denied that the face in the mirror was hers. Some witnesses came forward saying that they saw a young male skateboard rider riding a skateboard down on the footpath outside this retirement village near the time of the murder. An updated sketch was produced, but again to John's benefit, as the profile was incorrect. This goes to show how witness sightings alone are not enough. By this point, the pressure on the police was mounting, and John Glover's confidence was only growing, making for a very dangerous time for the Mossman community. Several days later in Lane Cove, Sydney, a few kilometers from Mossman, John Glover was fated to meet his next victim. A 78-year-old woman named Dorothy Binky was walking down the main street of Lane Cove when she was approached by a seemingly very nice and polite man, John Glover. John offered to help her carry her shopping bag, and they both made their way to Dorothy's house. Dorothy was pleased with John's kindness, and so she offered to repay his favors with a warm beverage. Amazingly, John declined. It looked as though John had a moment of consideration for his actions and may have turned over a new leaf. However, this did not last very long. In fact, it didn't even last an hour. Soon enough, John Glover returned to the hunt. As he retraced his steps back to the main street in Lane Cove, he passed Margaret Powden, an 85-year-old widow. Margaret was totally unaware of his presence as she turned on an alleyway towards her home. John followed closely behind. He then pulled out his cloth-covered hammer and brutally attacked Margaret. Sticking to the same script, he then removed her tights and underwear again and placed her walking stick neatly at the side of her body, leaving her alone on the ground, fighting for her life. This audacious act occurred in full view of an adjacent retirement village and a nearby school. Yet shockingly, nobody witnessed anything. Margaret was later discovered by a schoolgirl on her way home from the local shop. At first, the girl approached with curiosity, mistaking Margaret for a pile of rags, until she realized that blood was pooling from the injured head of Margaret as she lay face down. Shocked, the girl ran straight to her mother in the nearby apartment, who then rushed to the scene. The woman checked for breathing and then called an ambulance. Although Margaret was still alive when she was found, she was pronounced dead shortly after by medical services. Despite repeated warnings not to wash down the scenes where elderly people may have, quote-unquote, fallen, neighbors soon washed down the crime scene for the third time, removing potential forensic evidence. With the body count of elderly women now totaling 3 dead and 1 survivor in 7 months, all victims bludgeoned and bashed in broad daylight, the tabloids gave the killer a name, the Granny Killer, and the name stuck. On the November 3, 1989, at a retirement village in Belrose, John Glover continued his killing spree. 81-year-old Olive Cleveland was sitting on a bench enjoying the distant ocean views, when her tranquility was disrupted by an unwelcome stranger. John forcibly escorted her down a set of steps and bludgeoned her with his hammer before proceeding to pull up her dress and this time, using her tights to strangle her so viciously that the fabrics embedded itself in her neck. After rifling through her handbag, he placed it beside her with her shoes and walking stick. Olive's body would soon be found and was transferred to a small in-house morgue. The police were soon on the scene, only to find another crime scene that had been meticulously cleaned. These abhorrent murders were unfolding without a trace of the perpetrator, leaving the investigators perplexed. And why were these heinous acts going unnoticed by the community? Surely someone must have witnessed something. Detective Ron Milton recognized a pattern: the use of tights to strangle the victim. This method to him symbolizes the offender's desire to sexually humiliate the victims while expressing his brutality. The excessive violence employed suggests that the killer's motive extended beyond mere homicide. There was a disturbing blend of sexual deviance and the need to degrade. Moreover, the neatness with which the crimes were executed hinted at a perpetrator with military training. But the fact that all of the victims were elderly complicated the profile, suggesting a deeper motive. There were more questions than answers, but the police were getting closer. The investigators needed answers quickly, so they created an official task force of hand-picked detectives, increasing the number to 70 working on the case. Also, a reward was offered for information leading to the arrest of the murderer, $200,000. A sickening and truly twisted piece of information regarding the case was that John Glover would sit at home and watch the news, making fun of the police. He was laughing at the cleanups that followed his killings whilst his own family were in the room. He had insights into what the police were thinking at all times through the intense media coverage of the killings. The granny killer was on a roll, and he wanted nothing more than to add an extra tally to his list of serial killings. The fifth victim was a sharp-minded 92-year-old woman named Muriel Beryl Falcona. Mrs. Falcona was a very strong-willed and fiercely independent elderly woman who owned a very large Federation-style house down Muston Street, Mossman. On Thursday, November 1989, Muriel was walking home back from shopping. Little did she know that John had cast his murderous eyes upon her and began his stalking. John swiftly walked back to his car to retrieve his hammer, and he caught up with Muriel. And just as she entered the sanctuary of her home, John hit her with his hammer in the back of the head. When she attempted to get up from the floor, John hit her a second time. On the third strike, there was no sign of struggle or an attempt to get up. The theory is that Muriel may have been making noise. So with one final third blow, John murdered Muriel Falcone. He then proceeded to degrade the poor lady. John strangled her with her tights and stole her money. John then left the crime scene. Muriel's body was found and reported to the police. One of her neighbors had noticed that her Meals on Wheels was left outside. This was very unlike Muriel, so the neighbor went inside her home to go and check on her. As she made her way inside the house, she found Muriel dead with blood absolutely everywhere. But luckily for once, John had left an intact crime scene littered with blood-stained footprints. Investigators were soon on the scene. Plaster casts were made of the footprints, as well as other footprints in the nearby mud surrounding the house. Despite wanting to keep the evidence of footprints under wraps from the media, it wasn't long before the news outlets were showing the police investigating the footprints surrounding the scene. John smiled in his armchair, as he knew they were also taking plaster casts in areas that he did not go. A door-to-door questioning of the area yielded no results, leaving investigators to speculate whether the killer is so unremarkable that he simply just blends into the community, an unsettling thought for the people now gripped by fear. Following the Falcone murder, a surge of information swelled the suspect list to 740 individuals. Meanwhile, Detective Sergeant Paul Tuxford, an old-fashioned investigator with a keen analytical mind, pored over every police running sheet, searching for overlooked angles or leads. He decided to go and revisit Muriel's neighbor, Maggie Hughes. Maggie was the one who had found her dead, and she revealed to him some previously unreported information. Her sighting of a gray-haired, middle-aged man in a silver suit on the afternoon of the murder. This revelation sparks intrigue, prompting Tuxford to consider how convenient would it be for the killer to blend in with the elderly residents of Mossman, gaining their trust before committing his heinous acts. Detective Sergeant Paul Tuxford then instructed the task force's computer expert to comb through crime reports from Lower North Shore in the past 6 months, specifically flagging incidents involving a gray-haired man. Within minutes, a pattern emerged. 6 reports detailing assaults of women of similar age to Falconer, and the other victims involving theft and violence. In the beginning of the video, I mentioned that John had attacked and stole from an elderly woman named Mrs. Hunter. Well, she was tracked down and she gave a detailed description of her attacker. A gray-haired, middle-aged man. In early 1990, the government escalated the Granny Killer Award to $250,000. On the January 11, 1990 at Greenwich Hospital, John entered the room of an elderly patient named Daisy Roberts, and he pretended to be a doctor. John placed his hands between Daisy's legs and touched her inappropriately, stating that he was there to check her temperature. Daisy later rightfully raised her concerns, but she was denied as the nurse explained the doctor did not visit her that night and that she must be mistaken. However, a different nurse decided to take action. She contacted the police to report an indecent assault complaint as it just didn't sit right with her. A young constable was dispatched to investigate. He discovered that a gray-haired pie salesman named John Wayne Glover had visited the hospital. John then became a suspect in this assault, and he was questioned by the police. Later that night, John consumed a large amount of whiskey and sleeping pills in an attempt to take his own life. John was quickly hospitalized, but he had left behind a note. His note was mostly the ramblings of a drunken man, but it also contained a chilling phrase, "No more grannies." In addition to this, the woman who had been overlooked for weeks. But soon enough, the young officer who took the photograph realized its potential relevance to the granny killer murders, and the pieces began to fall into place. In this period, John Glover was released from the hospital and returned to his normal life. He told those around him that the accusations were too much to handle. But the police were onto him. They surveilled him acutely and placed a tracker on his vehicle. On the March 19, 1990, under police supervision, John made his way over to a woman's home, 60-year-old Joan Sinclair. The two had what John would later describe as a platonic relationship. The police followed him all the way there and watched as Joan let John inside her home at 10 a.m. The police observed the premises, but they noticed no suspicious activity. As time passed, all the team could do was monitor the situation from a distance. 7 hours passed with concern growing. Joan owned dogs, and these dogs could be heard inside the home barking. Police then got permission to knock on the door under the guise of a noise complaint. But there was no response. When they looked through a window, they saw what appeared to be a human body lying on the ground right next to a hammer. Once the police got inside, they found Joan dead in the hallway with evidence indicating John's presence. John Sinclair had been brutally murdered in the same fashion as the previous murders, with blood spatters everywhere and left on the floor having been strangled by her tights. The search continued cautiously until they found John alive, but unconscious in the bathtub. They confirmed he was still breathing, prompting immediate action. He had swallowed a large amount of pills and downed a bottle of scotch, and laid in the bathtub waiting to die. The police were conflicted with differing emotions, but one thing was clear. They had their man, and they had to keep him alive so that he could go to trial and be punished for his crimes. John Glover was able to be saved and found himself in front of a judge and a jury. John pleaded not guilty on the grounds of diminished responsibility. After coming round from his attempt, John took the investigators around the previous crime scenes and gave detailed explanations on his crimes and how he committed them. Mental health professionals believe that he had carried out these sickening acts due to his deep-seated hatred for his mother and his mother-in-law, and due to an addiction to gambling machines, as after every murder, he would steal their money and go and spend it in these machines. What you may find surprising is that John was ruled as sane. But the jury's swift deliberation ended with John Wing Glover being pronounced guilty of all charges, including the 6 murders, making him one of Australia's most prolific killers. A father, a husband, and now a convicted murderer, he received a life sentence with no possibility of parole, forever labeled as the Granny Killer. However, despite the resolution of John's reign of terror, detectives remain convinced that he had committed even more murders. The police suspect that John may have attacked and killed 7 other elderly women, 4 in Victoria and 3 others in New South Wales. With the Granny Killer incarcerated, one might assume the nightmare had ended. However, John had one final move to make. On Friday, September 2005, he took his own life by hanging himself in prison, shocking many of those around him. Despite his declining health, his sudden death caught everyone off guard, and would be seen as a final blow to the families of those he murdered. Now, it is well known that John Glover likely killed more people, and it could be possible that he left behind a sinister clue. Before taking his own life, John gave a visitor a hand-drawn sketch. In this sketch can be seen the number 9. Some have dubbed this the confession sketch, and believe that John was trying to play a game with investigators, letting them know that he is guilty of a further 9 gruesome, unsolved murders. This case takes place in Sydney, Australia on the 02/February/1986. Anita Kobe was a 26-year-old woman from Sydney and was born on the November 2nd, 1956 to her parents Gary Lynch and her mother Grace Lynch. Anita was close with her family. They described her as beautiful inside and out. As a teenager, Anita participated in pageants, and she even won the Miss Western Suburbs pageant in November of 1979. Everyone who knew Anita said that she had the potential to become a model. Anita's mother was a nurse, and growing up, she didn't always have ambitions to follow in her mother's footsteps. But as she got older, she began to become more interested in the role and the opportunity to help people and to make a program at Sydney Hospital. Those who worked with Anita stated that she was a natural at the job, that she had a kind demeanor that put patients at ease. It was during her time there that she crossed paths with a fellow student named John Kobe. John would later say that when he saw Anita, he was immediately attracted to her. But he believed her to be so far out of his league that he didn't even attempt to ask her out on a date. He assumed it would be pretty much pointless. However, he wouldn't have to, as during one shift, Anita approached him and the two began chatting. Before too long, they planned to go out for dinner together at a restaurant. And from that point onwards, the two were almost inseparable, and they became incredibly close. In the first few months, they moved in together. The two dated for some time before becoming engaged, and soon after, Anita fell pregnant. The two were incredibly happy at the prospect of starting a family together. They announced it to their families, and things were looking good for the couple. However, Anita tragically suffered a miscarriage. But despite this, the couple stayed strong. And in 1982, they got married among a close-knit group of friends and family. Instead of having a honeymoon, they decided to put the money they saved towards renting a house. They got 2 dogs and purchased a boat. After getting married, the two moved to Coffs Harbour. It's here when John began working with horses and training them. This endeavor happened to pay off for John. He placed a bet on one of the horses that he trained, and the bet came in. He ended up winning over $10,000, which in today's money, accounting for inflation, would be $51,500. With this money, they decided to go on a trip of a lifetime, and they traveled the world together. After some time traveling, John became satisfied with what they had done and what he had seen, and now he wanted to settle down and begin their family. However, Anita wasn't sure if she wanted this anymore. Her perspective had changed during their travels, something that is rather common. Anita and John found themselves on divergent paths, and in 1986, the couple decided to separate, recognizing Career and was living with her parents in Blacktown. Despite the separation between Anita and John, they remained amicable, and they cared for each other deeply. John would later describe the split as just more of a break than an actual full-on breakup. And by January of 1986, they were even considering the possibility of getting back together again. But they were taking things slowly. The couple even began looking for houses together to continue their lives. On the February 2nd, 1986, Anita was working in Sydney. On this day, she had finished her work at the Sydney Hospital at 3 p.m. before meeting up with some friends for dinner in Redfern. Anita then caught a train from Central Railway Station to Blacktown Station. She would usually call her father to pick her up. But on this night, the phone box was broken, and there were no taxis available. 2 witnesses would later recall seeing Anita after she left the train station. In the darkness, Anita walked home along Newtown Road in Blacktown, when all of a sudden, a gang of 5 men pulled up in a stolen car, coming to an abrupt halt right beside her. In a horrifying blow, 2 of the men lunged from the vehicle, forcibly dragging her into the car, while Anita screamed for help. The abduction did not go unnoticed. A brave teenage boy accompanied by his younger sister and mother rushed outside upon hearing the screams. The boy's instinctual response was to intervene, but the abductors wasted no time and sped away in their car before he could reach it. He returned home and alerted the police about the horrifying spectacle he had just witnessed. The teenager recalled seeing the men inside the vehicle. He remembered seeing the men in the back seat sitting higher than usual. Their heads were almost touching the roof. This was because the men were sitting on Anita, restraining and hiding her. In what was certainly the most terrifying car ride anyone could imagine, Anita was ordered to take off her clothes by the men. She refused this demand. She begged the men to let her go, telling her abductors that she was married and menstruating, hoping that this would be enough to evoke some form of compassion from them and to be spared. But these men had no such compassion. Instead, they began to savagely beat Anita. The beating was so severe that her nose and both cheekbones were shattered. The pain and fear she must have experienced is unfathomable. After shattering the bones in her face, the men forced her to perform oral on all 5 of them. The men then drove to an all-night petrol station. They took Anita's purse and her money, and they filled up their tank with it. All the while, Anita was pinned down naked in the back seat. Anita was continually beaten and essayed by her attackers as they drove her to a secluded field in Prospect. Anita was so badly beaten that she was unable to walk. She was dragged along a barbed-wired fence into a field, where the men continued to attack her for some time. 4 hours, she was beaten and essayed by the men. A farmer who lived near the secluded field heard the sounds of screaming. He assumed the screams were that of either an animal or some teenagers messing around. He had no idea about the horrific reality. After hours of torment, the men began to realize that if they let her go, she would be able to identify them. The ringleader of this group then decided to kill Anita. He pulled out his knife and, urged on by the other men, he walked towards Anita. Anita anticipated what he was going to do, as he brought the knife to her neck. As he did, Anita grabbed hold of the sharp blade. She held onto it tightly, and a brief struggle ensued. This resulted in some of Anita's fingers to be almost severed. The attacker sawed through her fingers, and after sawing through her fingers, he began to saw through her throat so mercilessly that she was almost beheaded. In one final act of unfathomable brutality, her lifeless body was placed on a barbed wire fence before all 5 of the men fled from the scene. They took her clothing and burned all of the evidence. When Anita failed to return home that night, her parents believed that she spent the night with a friend. However, her absence from work the following day prompted them to report her as missing on the February 3rd. The very next day, a farmer discovered her dead body in her field. The police assumed that the body in the field must be Anita, as her parents had just reported her missing. Anita's wedding ring was still on her finger. An investigator went over to Anita's parents' house and asked them if they recognized the ring. Her family recognized it immediately. John was told of Anita's murder. It was news that absolutely crushed him. He didn't want to accept that his wife was dead, and he greatly struggled with the news. Just 3 days after hearing about the death, he turned to illegal substances to help him cope. Officers got to work right away to find the killer or killers. But of course, in these kinds of cases, it is often someone the victim knows. A friend, a family member, a spouse. It was well known that John and Anita's relationship had been on the rocks. To many, it seemed all too obvious that John was the killer. Suspicion immediately fell upon him. Even those who knew John suspected that he was the one who took her life. Investigators pretty much felt like the case was closed, but they needed to prove that it was actually John who had killed her. They began to question him. However, their interrogation techniques, at least according to John, were rather suggestive and violent. They began telling John that he was guilty, that they knew it was him, and that he should do the right thing and confess. According to John, they even slammed him against the wall and against the floor. John did feel some guilt. He felt as if he should have been the one to pick up Anita from the restaurant. As if he did, none of this would have happened. But this is an incredibly unfair way to view the situation, and John bears no responsibility whatsoever for what those men did. But because of the guilt he already felt, the fogginess of his brain, the hours of questioning, the physical attacks, the constant blame, and how he should admit to it, John eventually admitted to the murder. He began to even question himself and thought that if the police were so sure of his guilt, then he must have done something. But things just didn't add up. As the police probed further into the horrific case, they began to realize that they were wrong about John. The series of events that led up to the murder didn't make sense, and John was ultimately ruled out as a suspect. John then spiraled into a deep depression as the investigation continued. Due to the barbarity of the crime, officers began to worry that those responsible could strike again if not caught soon. The funeral of Anita soon rolled around. The event was well documented by the media. The family would later recall seeing John break down, screaming and begging for Anita not to be taken away. In a move that was considered to be rather controversial, a radio host read out the explicit details from Anita's autopsy report live on air. This very much fueled the public outrage and galvanized the search for her murderers. The autopsy report was truly horrific. Anita's body had been so badly beaten that her injuries even shocked the most seasoned officer and coroner. The men had tortured her to a horrific degree. She had cuts on her body from being dragged over a barbed wire fence while she was still alive. Several cuts to her neck, and her ear was almost severed. She had extensive and extreme bruising to her face, head, shoulders, leg, groin, back, and thighs. The attackers seemed to have specifically targeted her breasts and groin, as these were severely damaged. Her windpipe was severed, and her 3 fingers had nearly been totally severed. This was from when Anita defended herself from the attackers. In fact, it seemed that Anita fought incredibly hard for her life, as the coroner found many defensive wounds completely black. Both of her cheekbones were shattered, and both shoulders were dislocated. There were also rumors that a knife had been used on Anita's genitals as a way to torture her, although the coroner later refuted this claim. The government then posted a substantial reward of $50,000 for information leading to the capture of her killer or killers. It was clear to those who carried out the autopsy that Anita would have suffered an extremely painful death. Her murder, even to this day, is considered to be one of Australia's most horrific. And to many people, this is the worst. The name Anita Colby is very well known in the country. After the autopsy results were read out on the radio, the public became infuriated and demanded justice. Justice. They wanted the people responsible to hang. Investigators then retraced Anita's last known movements, hoping that reenacting her last days alive could trigger some witnesses to come forward. A crucial breakthrough came when a police informant tipped authorities off about a stolen car. This would later lead to the arrest of John Travers and Michael Murdoch. Travers admitted that he had stolen the car, but made conflicting statements about the murder and was detained in police custody. They believed that he was responsible, but they couldn't get a confession out of him. John Travers then requested that a friend be called, and the number of this friend was handed to the investigating police who contacted the woman. The woman turned out to be John Travers' auntie and was dubbed Mrs. X. Mrs. X agreed to help with the investigation, giving authorities details of John's background. Despite being a relative, Mrs. X was disturbed and disgusted by what had happened to Anita Colby. She believed that if John was indeed guilty of this crime, then he should face justice. Conversation with both John Travers and Michael Murdoch. Both of the men admitted to the crime. This then led to the arrest of 3 brothers, Michael, Gary, and Les Murphy. All 5 men were charged with the murder of Anita Colby. It was within 22 days of the murder that all 5 men were charged, with the police commended for their swift and efficient response. Michael Murphy and his brother Gary were the last to be caught as they were on the run. They were eventually found, and when Gary was arrested, he was so frightened that he wet himself. A struggle ensued, and Gary tried his best to resist arrest. This resulted in his face being scraped all across the ground as he was arrested, causing great injury to his skin. Gary would later claim that the police did this deliberately. When the news broke that the men had been caught, hundreds gathered at the station. People were absolutely furious. Some officers were even worried that the mob that had gathered would try and drag them into the streets and to seek their own justice. So now the killers were caught, but there was a haunting question that gnawed at the public's collective conscience. Just who would commit a crime so unimaginably cruel? The ringleader of the gang was John Travers, only 18 years old at the time of the murder. John had a long history of criminal activity. He was the oldest of 8 children and was raised in poverty in Blacktown. By the age of 14, he was already an alcoholic and was expelled from school. When his father left the family in 1981, John relied on petty crime to provide for his family before his mother's health deteriorated so severely that he and his siblings were sent off to live with foster families. Most disturbingly was John's history of violent behavior that would foreshadow the brutal murder of Anita Colby. He displayed violent impulses towards men, women, and often animals. It is alleged that he would essay birds that he would steal before butchering them and cooking them. He would also essay lamb and sheep before butchering them and roasting their carcasses. Michael Murdoch was John's childhood friend and criminal associate. He spent a large portion of his youth in juvenile prisons, where he experienced extreme violence. The trial of Anita Covey's murder began in Sydney on March 16, 1987. As they were marched into the courtrooms, crowds gathered, many pointing at Gary as he walked in and saying, "That's the coward who wet himself." The prosecution presented a compelling case against the accused. They relied on forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and the confessions obtained during the police investigation. The defense for the accused mounted various strategies, including attempting was during his arrest. One of the officers who had arrested him was brought into the courtroom. Gary's defense lawyer questioned the officer, demanding to know why Gary's face had been all scratched up. The officer replied, "It must have happened when up." The officer replied, "It must have happened when I had my boot on his head." The defense argued that the confessions were coerced and that the forensic evidence might not be conclusive. The trial was a spectacle with the public closely watching on in hopes that justice would be served. After a lengthy and emotional trial, the jury returned its verdict. John Travers, Michael Murdoch, and the Murphy brothers were all found guilty of abduction, essay, and the murder of Anita Covey. They were all sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release. It also came to light that in the weeks before he killed Anita Covey in February of 1986, John Travers also put a knife to the neck of a 17-year-old in Western Australia and forced himself upon him. The two attacks were almost identical, but the 17-year-old's life was spared. Despite the maximum sentences, many of the public found this to be too lenient. The public wanted them to suffer the same fate as Anita, or at the very least, have them executed. There were images of some of the killers smiling after being charged, clearly having zero remorse for the hideous crime. The lack of remorse angered the public a great deal more, leading to further calls for them to be put to death. Following the tragic loss of their daughter, Anita Covey's parents joined forces with the parents of another murder victim, and together, they founded the Homicide Victim Support Group, a community organization to aiding families dealing with heinous crimes. Anita's parents also played a significant role in advocating for tougher sentences in the wake of their daughter's murder. These efforts eventually led to changes in the legal system. One of the 5 men, Michael Murphy, died in Long Bay Hospital on February 21, 2019 at the age of 66. The other men remain behind bars. Some of them have faced regular beatings from other inmates. John Covey is always happy to hear of the news of the beatings against these men. In an interview, John said, "I still dream about killing them. Revenge was high on what I thought. It was crippling. It was such a negative thought, and I lived with that for years and years. I would still kill them in a second, in a heartbeat, and no qualms. I'm happy to go to jail for the rest of my life. In my dreams, I've killed them in so many different ways. They've had such a long-lasting effect on me." On one occasion, one of the killers had been so badly beaten in prison that he had to go to hospital. It was later revealed that Gary was being treated in the same hospital that John Covey was nursing in. John said that when he found out, he felt absolutely sickened. John told those close to him that Gary is lucky that he didn't know he was in the hospital, because if he did know, he said he would have killed him in a second. As the years went by, John Covey was able to beat his addictions and was able to move on and meet someone else. He even remarried and had 2 children, but the couple have since separated. John also changed his name from Covey to Francis in 1987, as he felt the name Covey made him synonymous with the murder of Anita, and he also felt responsible for her death. However, years later, he decided to change his name back to Covey with his children supporting him and following suit. They too changed their names from Francis to Covey. Both of Anita's parents have since passed away. Anita's sister has said that her parents never got over the death of Anita. They struggled with it every day of their lives. Mrs. X, the woman who was able to help bring the killers to justice and recorded her nephew's secret confession, is still to this day in witness protection. There are those who were close to the killers who were not so happy with her involvement, and those people want her dead. For simply doing the right thing, she still receives very credible death threats. The trial of Anita Covey's murderers was a pivotal moment in Australian legal history. The verdict brought a small sense of closure to Anita's family and to the public. Even those who had never even met Anita were heavily invested in the case. A plaque was placed in the Sydney hospital to honor the life of Anita. Now, this is something that is truly disgusting. The New South Wales Bar Association has backed a plan that could turn the definition of a life sentence on its head and would allow Anita Covey's 4 surviving killers to seek leniency and a potential release. Offenders once considered to be violent and dangerous could be released after imprisonment, counseling, and simple maturing. Anita's family fought hard to make sure the killers would never be released. So in many people's eyes, to have them have the slightest chance of release would be a great injustice. As I said earlier, this case is considered to be one of the worst in Australian history. So if there are any signs that these men are likely to be released, the Australian citizens will likely protest the decision. If any of the killers are to be released, I shall do my best to let you all become aware. We can only hope that the 4 remaining killers are kept where they belong.